Okay, we are live streaming on Facebook now, Venerable Roshi. First of all, I would like to welcome all the listeners of Ambedkar Caravan to this very wonderful event where a very special person is going to give a Dharma talk today. And as you know that we have been bringing to you a lot of people who talk about the on the different issues, but today is a very special day where we are bringing to you Roshi Joan Halifax, who is a very important person in the Buddhist world today. And you won't believe, looking at her enthusiasm, that she is now 80 and she has been practicing Buddhist for a very long time. And her approach to Buddhism is meditative, as well as her approach to Buddhism is very socially, I would say even politically engaged. And she has been teaching and learning in for a long time. At the same time, she's not just sitting on the cushion and practicing. She's also going out in the world. She goes to Nepal. Even at this age, she goes to Nepal and she tries to work with her friends there. And she's kind of completely immersed into the community life. She runs a very interesting program in America called in Upaya Jain Center. She is the abbot, the head of the Upaya Jain Center, and she runs very interesting program where she trains young people in chaplaincy. And it has been one of the very remarkable contribution of Venerable to the burgeoning Buddhist movement in America. She came in contact with Buddhism when in the during the 60s, when the anti-war, anti-race movements were going on, and that has informed her practice, her worldview, and her engagement with the world. So she is also involved in how to transform this structural violence that we see in the form of the race, the form of caste, in the form of gender, how that can be transformed and so directly to those who are suffering. So she brings something very unique to the Buddhist world today. The title of a talk is very interesting, and I would just read out the title of the talk before I formally welcome Venerable. So her talk will be focused on the topic title called Meeting the Buddhas in Our World Today, Social Engagement as a Path of Compassion and Courage. So it's a very combination of compassion and courage in the world. We need both in the world today. So very warm welcome, Roshi, to this very interesting talk. Very warm welcome.
Mangesh, I'm so grateful for this invitation to speak. I want to thank you so much. Yeah. We met over a decade ago in Japan when we spoke in Japan about socially engaged Buddhism. And I felt a real connection with you and also with your Kalyana Mitra, with your community. As we were sitting in this kind of nice hotel in Tokyo with 1,000 Buddhists from all over Asia. But I was most happy, especially to be with you and your community. And as you can imagine, I've long admired Abmedkar and his imperative that has touched millions of people to educate, to agitate, and to organize. And I think that this imperative, this directive, is so important today in terms of what's happening in our world, vis-a-vis the racist violence, the political corruption, the pandemic that's affecting people all over the globe, and our climate catastrophe. As you said, Mangesh, I've, since I was a young woman, been involved with social issues and political issues that I have felt have been morally what could I say, morally undermining the moral character of people everywhere. And that our capacity to stand up in the midst of suffering is a capacity that I discovered when I also was a young woman, really came from the teachings of the Buddha and the practice that the Buddha taught. The Buddha said, I teach one thing and one thing only, the truth of suffering and the ending of suffering. And that's why we're here this morning, to explore this not only in terms of our individual life, but in the life of the world. I was born in the early 1940s during a terrible war, a war that was intent upon eradicating fascism. I was also a child when the nuclear bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and on Nagasaki, this in 1945. When those bombs were dropped, on that day and for weeks thereafter, 250,000 men, women, and children died. Many on the same day that those bombs were dropped. And the dropping of the weapons of mass destruction on these Japanese cities ushered in a new era when the human inclination toward violence can now destroy the entire human race and basically make the earth uninhabitable, but for all of, except a few resilient species. And it's 75 years since this horrifying event. The urgency of the Second World War, I believe, got into the psyche, into the heart of many in my generation. Please understand, my generation, many thousands of my generation wanted to end violence in the world, direct violence, the direct violence of war, the direct violence of racism. But we also wanted to address the profound issues that feed structural violence in our world, including violence that is race-based, violence that is tribal-based, discrimination against women, people of color, and even discrimination against the natural world. So, I want to say that our background, our early lives, the ground where the root of our life has gone deep, that makes up our life. And I think that the community of which Mangesh is a part, the community that Abmedkar nourished with his vision, is a community that has the power to be a force for good in terms of social transformation. So I want to talk a little bit about my early life, but also to say right now, I am sitting in an old cabin in the state of New Mexico in the United States. New Mexico is quite unpopulated. It is also a place where there's mountains and desert. And because of the pandemic, I've come up to my hermitage in order to quarantine myself and to be in quarantine because the pandemic is very poorly controlled in my country. Where I'm living in this place, I'm up at over 3,000 meters in altitude. And Mangesh asked me, is it cold where you are, Roshi? Yeah, it's cold here at this altitude and up in the mountains. But I'm grateful to be able to have this time. of deep practice, but also of very deep work online with people from all over the world. As Mangesh said, he said I was 80. No, I'll be 78 in less than a week. I was born, as I mentioned, in the 1940s. I was born during the war, the atom bomb, nuclear holocaust really touched my life. I became aware of it as a child. Also the Holocaust in Germany, where the camps where Jews and homosexuals and gypsies were brought and were killed. The creation of the United Nations in the 1940s also gave us a kind of hope that there could be world peace. And then Gandhi was shot. For many of us in our country, he represented a force for peace. I remember also being a girl in the 1950s, a young woman in the 1950s, where mass media, television became something that was everywhere, but also there was a lot of denial. And that denial around issues related to race in my country, the United States, but also in your country. And Abmedkar had brought this into great visibility in India. And his efforts also became a source of inspiration for us in the late 1950s and also in the 1960s, where the pernicious racism in our country became something of many of us worked to transform in our work in the civil rights movement. I think that people my age, when we were in our 20s, this was in the 1960s, were basically heartbroken about the world. And we were not only heartbroken, but we were also angry. And I discovered Buddhism in the mid-1960s. I'm so grateful because it was a way that I could temper my temper and to engage in the civil rights movement and as well in the anti-war movement, particularly in relation to the war in Vietnam, through a perspective, through a view that was basically Buddhist, a view of nonviolence in the world. In the 1970s, one of the important forces in my life was feminism. How it was essential for women to stand up and send their voice in the world, that women were a force for change in the world. And I say this to you, women who are listening today. I appreciate the collaboration from men. I appreciate the support from men, but women, how we raise our children and how we send our voice in the world. I believe, as we're seeing today in terms of women who are leading countries, like New Zealand, for example, women who are leading countries from a base of love and compassion, very important. And also in the 1970s was the first Earth Day. And this was a day when we recognized as a global community, our responsibility to take care of Mother Earth, to end violence toward the earth, to end the exploitation of what we called natural resources. These are not resources. This is our life, our very life. And so many of us from the 1960s and 1970s, and I call this out to you as well, because you understand as Buddhists the power of interbeing, of interconnectedness, of interdependence, of interpenetration, that without the earth being healthy, we cannot be healthy. I'm taking you through the decades. The internet came in the 1980s to be a really important force, and as well the AIDS epidemic, where many of us who were young people in the 60s began to work in the AIDS epidemic. And we realized how powerful the truth of interdependence is in relation to a global pandemic. The first being brought into focus in my lifetime being AIDS, but of course the pandemic of 1918, of the early 1900s, which also we realized was also global. And now we're in another pandemic. So in the 90s, we began to really touch the force of globalization and be touched by it. And to also see the power of technology, which at this very moment, interconnectedness that you and I can meet over through the medium of technology. You know, I was saying to Mangesh, in this cabin, which has solar panels, so we have light, but also we're not on the grid, so to speak, but we have a dish out in our back of this cabin, which sends the signal of my voice and my image up 37,000 miles to a satellite and is sending it to you at this very moment. So the powers of technology to not only connect us, and again, it's such a powerful process, which is reflected in the Buddhist teachings of Indra's net, again, back to interbeing, but also with globalization, feeding economies of harm and economies that marginalize those who have less access to education, who have less access to economies of peace. And now we see, you know, in this 21st century, so vividly, the effects of the climate catastrophe on our lives. I see it in India, but also in New Mexico. Here, I'm happy the monsoons have come, but we had very little rain in May and June and the first half of July. And you could see the threat of wildfire, and you could see the trees dying. So we have tremendous responsibility, not only as unique individuals, but also as communities of principle, communities of care, to address the issues that are related to social and environmental transformation. And we have to recognize that by 2050, there will probably be more than 9 billion people on this earth. And you know, one of the interesting things, for example, that has happened during this global pandemic has been the effect of, there's been less, if you will, planetary noise. In other words, the impact, the seismic impact of even a population of 7 billion people in terms of what the geologists are hearing in the movement of the earth. Think of that impact with 9 billion people. The pandemic has made our earth more stable and more silent in a way, even in spite of the great suffering that has unfolded with this pandemic. But we know with 7 billion people and moving toward 9 billion, more than 9 billion people, that the demand for energy, for water, and food which has contributed already to our climate catastrophe, which is contributing to the 6th mass extinction and to this global epidemic that we're in right now, and is also contributing to political chaos and to racist violence. So that's the bad news. And there's plenty of it. And as I said, the millions of people in your Kalyana Mitra, in this community of Abmedkar, you have a mass and force that I believe will be and can be a force for positive change in our world. So you are part of the good news. You're here today. Clearly, the transformation of structures of violence into structures of peace, into structures of inclusivity, of non-discrimination, of non-harming, comes through you. It comes through each one of us, but it also comes through communities that are bonded, that care, and also that are principled. And this is about actualizing in the details of our lived experience, respect, integrity, empathy, courage, compassion, and wisdom. And for us, as a community of peace, affirming the value put on these precious human qualities. And that's why you're here today. You have made a choice. We have made a choice to be people dedicated to the cultivation of love and wisdom in an ever-increasing connected world, to be dedicated to ending violence, to ending caste violence, to ending racial violence in our world, to ending violence toward women, to ending violence toward the earth. And just as we have witnessed huge phase shifts in our time, for example, like the Berlin Wall coming down, or like Abmedkar emerging from the ground of India to be a voice, a visionary voice in the world. We've witnessed these huge shifts, these phase shifts in our time, where the walls that separate us from each other, the walls that separate us from the earth, from our basic goodness, the walls that separate us from each other are coming down as we stand in peace, as we stand in justice, working toward the realization of nonviolence in our time. So you might ask, why did I become a Zen person? I am a Zen person. That's one identity. In Zen, we say, the plague of identities. That's one identity. I am a woman. I'm an elder. But I'm just a human. But Zen really touched me in my youth, partly because of the war in Vietnam, where in the mid-1960s, I had the opportunity to walk down Fifth Avenue, protesting the war. Fifth Avenue is in New York City, protesting the war. And in that crowd of 100,000 men and women and young people and children was one quiet man named Thich Nhat Hanh, Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh. And it was my encounter with him in the mid-1960s that actually brought me to the realization that you could be a social activist and as well as a contemplative. Years later, I met another Zen teacher. I'd been practicing Buddhism for many decades. And this teacher was an American. His name was Roshi Bernie Glassman. And he was very much in the forefront of socially engaged Buddhism in our country. And he also was doing something that was really radical. And that was meeting with hundreds of us in Auschwitz, a concentration camp in Eastern Europe, in Poland, where millions of Jews, where gypsies, and where homosexuals were being murdered. And we would sit in this concentration camp doing what is called a bearing witness retreat, hundreds of us, while the names of those who were killed in the concentration camp were being recited. And we would bear witness to the truth of suffering, but also to the possibility of the transformation of suffering. And this experience of bearing witness, of sitting in this charnel ground, was a way for us to actually live by vow, to affirm our vows, to be in a community that entered into a vowing perspective, which was about ending violence in our world. Bearing witness. And Glassman Roshi and his wife, Jishu Angyo Holmes, both now having passed over, both now ancestors, shared with me, and this was in the mid-1990s, their vision of a peacemaker order, which was based on 3 tenets. The first tenet was of not knowing. And, you know, in the West, we're very attached to knowing. We stand in our capacity to be well-educated and to use facts and data and information in a way as instruments of power. They can also be instruments of positive power, of transformation. But we often lack the humility to be simply open, to inquire, to investigate, which is one of the factors of enlightenment, as I think many of you know as Buddhists. What is it to really rest in wisdom, in not being super conceptual, but to be open to things just as they are, and to look in a fresh way at reality as it is, not knowing. And then the second tenet that Glassman Roshi and Jishu Angyo Holmes shared and taught, that was the tenet of bearing witness. And this is what we did in Auschwitz. What is it to bear witness? Bear witness to the suffering in the world. Bear witness to our own suffering, and as well to bear witness to the joy in the world, to the goodness in the world. Bear witness. And from not knowing and bearing witness, then compassionate action arises, which is the third tenet. So this was really, these 3 tenets were really moving for me. As an anti-war activist, as someone who's been engaged in issues related to the ending of racial violence in my own country, of working with dying people, of working as a volunteer inside the prison system. What is it to sit with not knowing, with bearing witness, and then to act? To engage in compassionate action in the world. You know, the Buddha said, my Dharma is swimming upstream. There's a powerful tide against which we are swimming now. But I believe in the strength of the Dharma. I believe that we can reach that other shore. I remember during the war in Vietnam, a man who ran for president, he didn't win, but he was a powerful voice for nonviolence in our world. His name was A.J. Muste. He would stand in front of the White House night after night with a single candle, a single lit candle, protesting the war in Vietnam. Many nights he was all alone. A reporter interviewed him one evening as he stood in the rain, shielding this candle. And the reporter said, Mr. Muste, do you really think you're going to change the policies of this country by standing out here alone with a candle? And Muste replied, oh, I don't do this to change the country. I do this so the country won't change me. It's not only us as communities, it's every single one of us. We must stand in the principles of nonviolence that the Buddha taught. We must stand in love, in compassion. We must stand with sympathetic joy in relation to the well-being of others, and we must stand with equanimity. This is what the Buddha taught. And yet, Lao Tzu said, every person is a good person. However, that's not the part that concerns us. Part of what we have to do is to have the clarity of heart-mind, the equanimity, the attentional balance to see clearly the truth of suffering, our own suffering and the suffering of others, the suffering that our systems also are operating out of, and to not deny the truth of suffering, and to not deny the presence of suffering, and to not deny impermanence, that things can change, and we can be part of that change. In the Mahayana tradition of which I am a part, it is said, bodhisattvas do not seek easy situations. We are not in an easy situation. We actually don't have to seek difficult situations. And yet, how we approach suffering is really essential to understand that we approach it from a place of strength, of courage, and also of hope, of possibility. I think that socially engaged Buddhism is a powerful vehicle for transforming suffering in our world today. For example, I look at the power of the Buddha ending the caste system within the Buddhist sect. And we have to live that. We have to not create more hierarchies. I think it would be against the grain of Buddha's heart to make more hierarchies. The fact also that Buddha ordained women, that he ordained Angulimala, who was a serial killer, that he didn't reject others. And that in Buddhism, as it went to China, Tibet, became a platform for the realization of the bodhisattva ideal, which is that we bring all others to the other shore, realizing the principles of mutual causality, of dependent origination, of interdependence, of the non-separation of theory and direct experience, our lived experience, of mindfulness, of the indivisibility of wisdom and compassion, and also the power of addressing the root poisons of greed, of hatred, and of delusion. And we as engaged Buddhists apply the insights that arise from our meditation practice in this experience of social transformation, of political transformation, and of addressing environmental and economic suffering and injustice and the relationship between these three. So I want to say just a few more things. I believe that the path through is compassion, the realization of compassion, of the seeing the deep awareness of the suffering of others and having the wish to transform that suffering. Compassion is the strength that arises when we perceive the true nature of suffering in the world and we're not separate from it. This is what Glassman Roshi says in terms of bearing witness. We are not separate from it. We're not a bystander. We are bearing witness to it. And also compassionate action. We aspire to transform it. And to every extent that we are able, we act to transform it. I believe that compassion is to have our heart engaged, not just to have our heart broken. Because if our heart is broken, there's a kind of aversion to suffering, but it's more that our heart is broken open to see the truth of suffering, to touch it, to be moved by it, and to let it move us. There are 4 aspects of compassion I want to briefly suggest at the end of this talk. One is from the Buddhist perspective to realize that we share both joy and suffering with all beings. We're not separate from any being or thing. And that we wish for all beings freedom from suffering. And that we respond to suffering, that we're there with it, and we act out of it. And that this is an act of fundamental intimacy, opening up to our basic humanity, and also having the capacity to live outside of time by being present in each moment. And having also the courage to work honestly with the qualities of heart and mind that are afflictive. You know, one of the great teachers of my life was the Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. In 1967, he said, "Our only hope lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and go out into a sometimes hostile world, declaring eternal hostility to poverty, racism, and militarism. This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is in reality a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love for all human beings. When I speak of love," said Reverend King, "I'm speaking of that force which all of the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. Love is somehow the key that unlocks the door which leads to ultimate reality." This is what I believe we Buddhists mean when we say live by vow. The vow to love, the vow to end violence, the vow to end war, the vow to end discrimination, the vow to end racism, the vow to end gender violence, the vow to meet each other and each thing through love. This is what I have faith in. And I have faith that we can do this now. In my School of Buddhism, when we finish a day of retreat, there are two verses that are chanted. I won't chant them, but I will say them to you because I want to share them with you. It seems like we're facing an impossible task, but I feel that we're facing a great possibility. And this possibility is to realize in our lifetime our bodhisattva nature, the nature of deep awakening based in compassion and wisdom. In the first short verse are the four vows of the bodhisattva. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to transform them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The awakened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. And then we hear the night chant. Let me respectfully remind you, life and death are of supreme importance. Time passes swiftly and opportunity is lost. Let us awaken. Awaken. Do not squander your life. So thank you for being with me. I'm so grateful for Mangesha's kind invitation, and we have some minutes to ask questions. And thank you, Mangesh, and thank you, everyone, for your presence.
Venerable, thank you so much for this very beautiful exposition of the Dhamma in our times. It is such a delight to listen to you, but as well to see you and behold you, Venerable. And very grateful for this opportunity to bring you to the community of the Ambedkarites. And you, in the end, brought a kind of connections between the bodhisattvic vows that you recited for us, and that is contained in this magnum opus that Baba Sahib Ambedkar has written for us, the Buddha and his Dhamma. These four vows are very much part of the Buddha and his Dhamma. So there are a lot of things that connect us emotionally and, in terms of our vision for the world. I will just, we will just talk about two important questions, and I thought they are very pertinent to the Ambedkarite situation here. Number one is, you have been a person who is involved in organizing things from a long time, and people bringing people together for a long time, and arranging the trainings and working across the borders, working with the different communities. So as you have recited in the beginning, the slogan that Baba Sahib Ambedkar has given to us: educate, agitate, and organize. And one of the most difficult part is to organize. So from your lifelong experience in organizing, how does Buddhism comes into play, and the principles of the Buddha that you found potent to organize the people, organize the communities, bring them together, work together, and really swim against this great tide that we face all the time. Because as you said, that alone it's very difficult to swim against these great tides. And if we can swim together and work together, that can be a great relief for us and others. So, in your lifelong work in organizing people and organizing communities, what kind of the Buddhist principles as you think are important for the Buddhist communities to uh, practice and bring alive?
So I think that the threefold training of Sila, Samadhi, Prajna, so important. I feel that having vows that are not formalistic, but that relate to our lived experience and to the conditions of the world, have vows that are really inspire moral character, where we feel that the best in us is being embodied by our organizers, our leaders, but in ourselves as well. And to not forget those vows, to remind ourselves on full moon and new moon and every day of the value of the vows, because when we live by vow, we're being Buddha. Those vows that the Buddha articulated are vows that exemplify what it is to be an awake, principled, loving, compassionate person,
Yes.
to be wise. And so these vows, Thich Nhat Hanh, he took the basic vows, the Mahayana vows, which are based on, of course, early Buddhism. He recrafted them. He reframed them so they're more contemporary. Bernie Glassman, the same. Myself, the same. Keeping the principles, the core principles in the vows intact, but understanding that we're living in a particular time and with particular issues. And so I remember when I was practicing with Thich Nhat Hanh years ago, and I won't be able to quote it, but exactly, but I think it's the first mindfulness training. Do not be bound to any theory, doctrine, or ideology, even Buddhist ones. All systems of thought are guiding means. They are not absolute truth.
Beautiful.
So, the harm done in the name of religion, he always emphasized, and I'm deeply aware because I was trained as an anthropologist and a social scientist, that religion can cause a lot of harm.
True, very true.
But it's to understand, our lives are not just about external religiosity. They're about living our basic goodness in the medium, through the medium of love and compassion. So our vows are essential. And our vows then become the platform where our practice is realized. In other words, if you're a mess and you're causing harm to others, it's really difficult to experience samadhi, concentration, awakening, connection. So, you begin to understand that our vows and our practice of meditation. So it's not just being a social activist going out and trying to change the world, or being a wonderful doctor at the technical level. It's really you have to practice, you have to engage in meditation in order to cultivate the capacities of deep equanimity and of prajna, of wisdom. Because the deeper that your practice is, the more consistent, the more realized your practice is.
Yes.
The more you see interconnectedness, the more you realize your subjectivity, your sense of self is not just this little tight ball of I, but it's all beings, it's all things, it's women, it's children, it's elderly, it's people of all color, it's all species, it's our very atmosphere. So the deeper your samadhi is, the deeper your connection with the experience of wisdom to actualize what it is to be a wise person, a compassionate person today. And that means that you're living by vow.
Yeah.
So you see the threefold training of the Eightfold Path.
Yeah.
This, I think, are the principles of how we organize. We understand, and the people who have a lot of responsibility and authority, live that way. They live by vow and inspire us, and they take care of us just like they take care of each other and themselves and the world. So I think that's how you organize. That's the best way. Living the Eightfold Path.
Yes. Well, that's very beautifully explained, Venerable. The way you have explained it is really fascinating. But these communities and organizing a very important aspect of the Buddhist practice. That takes me to the second question, and you might find it interesting. Like you come from a Zen tradition where the emphasis is on the sitting meditation, and there are a lot of Jain stories where the masters have chided their disciples for sitting too long. And it's like polishing the brick to make it into a mirror, like that story, famous story. And at the same time, your life is very engaged in the communities. And often there is this kind of dichotomy between, the individual practice and, sometimes it's going in one direction to one extremity, where people are, as you said, focused too much subjectively on their own experiences, realizing and, in the quest of the jhanas and all that paraphernalia that goes with it. And out there is a world which is which needs your attention, or not in an egoistically way your attention, but it needs, as you said, your attention, your care, and your love. So as a Zen practitioner, and
Mangesh, I want to say though, Mangesh,
please
there are many Dharma doors. No, I just want to say there are many Dharma doors. So I don't want to say engaged Buddhism is the only Dharma door. I have deep respect for deep contemplative practice, for the hermit tradition. So, I just happen to be born at a time where many of us became socially engaged Buddhist.
Right.
That was our era. And, it's Joanna Macy, myself, Sensei Alan Sonoke, we just, we're all kind of in the same age range, and we just got into it. But it's one Dharma door. But I will say it's a Dharma door that causes what John Lewis, a great civil rights worker and one of our most beloved senators, Afro-American, Black American, who just died, he said, good trouble. We all wanted to get into good trouble, if you know what I'm saying. We were dedicated to good trouble. But that's just, some of us, not all contemplatives.
And this is just the last question. as you said that we are dealing with complex issues in the society, and this kind of the interconnection between communities is so vital and so important. One of the reasons that the way untouchability is practiced, and even it's practiced today even in our country, a lot of instances where the people are dehumanized and uh, treated less than a human being, and the scale of suffering is so huge. So one of the impasses that Baba Ambedkar had to connect the communities with the larger global communities like the Buddhist communities and the civil rights communities and so on and so forth. And one of the aims of this, as you said, that when the communities come together, crossing the borders, crossing the racial borders, crossing the gender borders and linguistic borders, and they come together, it's itself some kind of a force for a good in the world. So how do you see the role of Buddhism emerging in this particular climate of the United States today? A regime and the quest for the racial justice in the United States, and similarly in India, we are having the similar kind of a regime, which is trying to create a kind of authoritarian, arrogant political force, and at the same time we have this burgeoning anti-caste movement in our country. So uh, as a Buddhist, how do you see these connecting points, these doors that can open into our hearts and create that beloved community, as one of your teachers, Martin Luther King, has emphasized so much, and what Baba Ambedkar called Dhamma Rajya, the kingdom of righteousness, the dharmic state. So where do you see these connections? How we can open these doors to each other and forge this quote unquote sangha for the better good in the world? Long
So
question. Long question,
I
but
think we're doing it right now.
yeah.
It's such a wonderful question, Mangesh. And I feel like we're doing it right now. People in my country, particularly individuals who are Buddhist, but I would say many men and women and young people in my country don't know much about Baba Ambedkar. And yet we've all heard about untouchables in some way or another. And what's happening right now, we meet in Japan through Alan Sonoki, Sensei Alan. Then you write me an email, and suddenly my community and your community are connected through our friendship, through Maitri. And we realize we share a common vision, which is the ending of violence. And we see that vision is not separate from what Bernie Glassman also shared with thousands of people by bringing us to Auschwitz, a common vision. People from Israel, people from Palestine, gypsies, camp survivors, all came to the death camps in Poland and sat on the tracks. And we realized we share a common vision, the ending of violence in our world. And when we begin to recognize our common humanity, which now in a weird kind of way, it's so strange, the pandemic, which has forced us to, for me, I'm always out there traveling and teaching. Suddenly I'm home. I'm in the mountains in isolation, but I have the opportunity now to connect with people all over the world through this hyper-connected technology. The very technology that is actually undermining values in the lives of millions of people becomes also a technology that is a platform for communion and communication. And so we're now shoulder to shoulder or face to face, image to image. We have a chance to spread the Dharma through this technology as never before, to use this medium as a way to foster economies of peace and a world of justice and a world of love. And thank you for allowing that connection to happen, Mangesh.
Venerable, this has been a very fantastic interaction with you, and I personally would like to express my gratitude to you for having accepted this invitation and creating an opportunity to talk to the larger audience. I see that there are thousands of people who have been listening to you, and it has been a wonderful, wonderful Dharma talk from you, and we would like to invite you again. But before I conclude formally, would you like to say something, some concluding words before we conclude this?
My gratitude is boundless. And I also want to just recall the words of the Buddha. I teach one thing and one thing only. The power of perceiving the truth of suffering and the liberation of understanding that we can, in this life, free ourselves and others from suffering. So may we do this, both as individuals, just with the next person that we encounter, and also for the world. Thank you, Mangesh. And
Thank you. So Roshi, thank you so much. And on the behalf of Ambedkar Caravan and the listeners of Ambedkar Caravan, I would like to say thank you to you for having made this time. I know that you are up on the mountains, 3,000 feet above, and there is a immense cold, and it's early morning there, 7 o'clock, and you have a very strict regime, with minimum resources. You are trying to put yourself to the practice of the Dharma. It's such a lovely to hear from you from there, and almost you bring your place to our hearts by talking to us through Zoom talk. And we would like to invite you again for more community interaction, and we would like to really treat this common path that the Buddha has given us and Baba Sahib Ambedkar has emphasized so much for the new world. So Roshi, Venerable Roshi, thank you so much for joining today, and we are looking forward to hear from you again and again and again.
Thank you, Mangesh, and thank you, everyone. You're so kind.
Thank you.